I found out my neighbor was giving tours of my house and collecting deposits from prospective renters while I was at work. And the worst part was that she had absolutely no legal right to do any of it. My name is Quincy Garrison, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Springs community in Scottsdale, Arizona, for about 3 years when this whole nightmare started. The neighborhood was one of those planned communities with identical beige houses, perfectly manicured lawns, and an HOA that seemed to have nothing better to do than measure the height of everyone's grass with a ruler. I worked as a software engineer for a tech company downtown, which meant I left early in the morning and usually did not get home until after 6 in the evening. My house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch style with a small backyard, and I had worked hard to make it my own despite the HOA's endless list of restrictions about what colors you could paint your front door and how many potted plants were allowed on your porch. The HOA president was a woman named Brenda Hutchinson, and she was exactly what you would picture when you heard the term HOA Karen. She was in her late 40s with that specific haircut that seemed to defy both gravity and good taste, always wore velour tracksuits in various shades of pink and purple, and had perfected the art of the condescending smile. Brenda lived 3 houses down from me in a slightly larger model, with an upgraded kitchen that she mentioned at every single HOA meeting. She had been president for 5 years, and in that time, she had turned our quiet neighborhood into her personal fiefdom where every minor infraction was treated like a federal crime. I had received my fair share of violation notices over the years. Once, she fined me $50 because my trash cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though I had just taken them out that morning and planned to wheel them back after work. Another time, she sent me a certified letter demanding I repaint my mailbox because the black paint had faded to what she described as an unapproved shade of dark gray. I paid the fines and dealt with her nonsense because fighting with the HOA seemed like more trouble than it was worth, and I had better things to do with my time. Things started getting weird in late September. I came home from work on a Tuesday evening and noticed that my welcome mat was not quite in the same position I had left it. I thought maybe the wind had shifted it or the mailman had kicked it accidentally, so I did not think much of it. But then the next day, I could have sworn my living room curtains were open wider than I usually left them. I always pulled them mostly closed before leaving for work because I did not like the idea of people being able to see directly into my house. But when I got home, they were open enough that you could see my entire couch and television setup from the street. I started to feel a creeping sense of unease, like someone had been in my house, but nothing was missing. My laptop was still on my desk. My television was still mounted on the wall, and all my other electronics were exactly where I had left them. I checked all the doors and windows, and everything was locked. I even looked for signs of forced entry but found nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I had just forgotten how I had left things that morning. The following week, I decided to leave work early one afternoon, because I had a dentist appointment that got canceled at the last minute. It was around 2 in the afternoon when I pulled into my driveway, and that was when I saw Brenda Hutchinson standing on my front porch with a young couple, using a key to unlock my front door. I sat in my car for a moment, completely stunned, watching as she pushed open my door and gestured for the couple to follow her inside my house. I got out of my car so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My heart was pounding as I walked up the driveway, and I could hear Brenda's voice floating out through my open front door, cheerfully describing the features of what she kept calling this lovely rental property. I stepped into my own house to find Brenda giving a full tour to 2 people I had never seen before in my life, pointing out my kitchen appliances like she owned the place. The young couple looked to be in their mid-20s, and they seemed genuinely interested in what Brenda was telling them. The woman was taking notes on her phone while the man opened my kitchen cabinets to inspect them. Brenda was in the middle of explaining that the stainless steel refrigerator was included with the rental when she finally noticed me standing in my own entryway. "Oh, Quincy," she said with that fake smile of hers, not even having the decency to look embarrassed. "You are home early. I was just showing the Martins your lovely home. They are very interested in renting it starting next month." I stared at her, my brain struggling to process what I was hearing. "What are you talking about? My house is not for rent." Brenda laughed like I had made a joke. "Well, you did submit the rental application form to the HOA last month. We have been working to find suitable tenants for you." "I never submitted any rental application," I said, my voice rising. "I live here. This is my home. Why do you have a key to my house?" The young couple exchanged uncomfortable glances, and the woman stopped taking notes. Brenda's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. "There must be some confusion. I have all the paperwork in my office. Perhaps we should discuss this privately after I finish showing the property." "Get out of my house," I said, pointing at the door. "All of you, right now." The couple did not need to be told twice. They practically ran out the door, mumbling apologies. Brenda, however, took her time, straightening her purple velour jacket and giving me a disapproving look like I was the one being unreasonable. "There is no need to be rude, Quincy. I was doing you a favor. The rental market is very competitive right now, and I found you excellent potential tenants who were willing to pay above market rate. I did not ask you to do that. I never gave you permission to enter my house or show it to anyone. How did you even get a key?" She waved her hand dismissively. "I am the HOA president. I have master keys to all the properties in Meadowbrook Springs for emergencies. It is in the bylaws you signed when you moved in." I felt my blood pressure spike. Emergency access does not mean you can just walk into my house whenever you want and give tours to strangers. That is breaking and entering. That is illegal. Brenda's expression hardened. "I would be very careful about throwing around accusations, Quincy. As HOA president, I have significant authority over this community, and I do not appreciate your tone. If you have a complaint, you can submit it in writing at the next HOA meeting. Now, if you will excuse me, I have other appointments." She walked past me and out the door before I could respond, leaving me standing in my living room, shaking with anger and disbelief. I immediately went through my entire house, checking every room to make sure nothing was missing or disturbed. Everything seemed to be in order, but I felt violated, like my privacy and security had been ripped away. I called a locksmith that same afternoon and had all my locks changed. The locksmith, a guy named Pete who had been working in Scottsdale for 20 years, told me that I was the third person that month who had called him about changing locks because of HOA disputes. He said that master keys for emergency access were legitimate, but using them for non-emergencies was definitely crossing a line. While he worked on installing new deadbolts, I went through every closet, every drawer, and every cabinet, looking for anything out of place. In my bedroom, I noticed that some of my personal papers on my desk had been moved. I always kept my bills and documents in a specific stack, and now they were slightly scattered. My mail had been opened. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the scene in my head, Brenda acting like she had every right to be in my house, showing it to strangers, talking about rental agreements I had never signed. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This was not just a violation of my privacy. This was fraud. She was pretending to have the authority to rent out my property and was presumably collecting money from people under false pretenses. The next morning, I called my real estate attorney, a woman named Susan Chen, who had helped me with the purchase of my house 3 years ago. I explained the situation, and she was silent for a long moment after I finished. "That is incredibly illegal," she finally said. "If she is actually collecting deposits or rent payments for a property she does not own and has no authority to rent, that is fraud. Possibly even grand theft depending on the amounts involved. You need to find out exactly what she has been doing and whether money has changed hands." "How do I do that?" I asked. "Start by documenting everything. Write down exactly what happened when it happened and who was there. If you can get the names of the couple she was showing your house to, even better. Check your HOA bylaws about the master key policy. And then I would recommend filing a police report. Even if they cannot do anything immediately, you want this on record." I spent my lunch break that day typing up a detailed account of everything that had happened. I included the dates when I had noticed things out of place in my house, the exact time I had caught Brenda giving the tour, and everything she had said. I also pulled out my copy of the HOA bylaws and read through the section about master keys. It was buried in the fine print on page 37, and it stated that the HOA president could maintain master keys for emergency access only, specifically defined as situations involving fire, flood, gas leaks, or other immediate threats to life or property. Showing my house to prospective renters definitely did not qualify as an emergency. That evening, I went to the Scottsdale Police Department to file a report. The officer who took my statement was a middle-aged man named Officer Martinez, and he listened to my story with increasing concern. He took down all the details and said that while this was definitely a civil matter that I would need to address through the courts, the potential fraud aspect made it a criminal issue as well. "Has she actually collected any money from anyone?" he asked. "I do not know," I admitted. "But she told those people that they could rent my house starting next month, which suggests she was planning to collect rent or deposits from them." "We will look into it," Officer Martinez said. "But you should also consider getting a restraining order if she continues to enter your property without permission. Changing your locks was smart. Do you have any security cameras?" I did not, but I went straight to the electronics store after leaving the police station and bought a complete home security system with cameras for the front door, back door, and garage. I spent the entire weekend installing them and setting up the monitoring app on my phone. If Brenda tried to enter my house again, I would have video evidence. The following Tuesday was the monthly HOA meeting, which was held in the community clubhouse near the neighborhood pool. I normally avoided these meetings because they were usually just Brenda droning on about grass height requirements and approved paint colors, but this time I made sure to be there. I walked in at exactly 7 in the evening, and the room was about half full with my neighbors, most of them looking bored or annoyed that they had to be there. Brenda sat at the front of the room behind a folding table with the HOA vice president, a timid man named Harold who never seemed to disagree with anything Brenda said, and the treasurer, an elderly woman named Doris. Brenda gave me a cold look when I walked in but did not say anything. I took a seat in the back row and waited. The meeting started with the usual reports about community finances and upcoming maintenance projects. Brenda announced that the HOA was planning to repaint all the community mailboxes and that each homeowner would be assessed a special fee of $75 to cover the cost. There were some grumbles from the audience, but nobody spoke up. Then came the section for homeowner complaints and concerns, and I raised my hand. Brenda looked at me like I was a bug she wanted to squash. "Yes, Quincy." I stood up so everyone could see me. "I would like to address an incident that occurred last week. I came home to find you, Brenda, inside my house without my permission, giving a tour to prospective renters and telling them that my house was available for rent. I never authorized this, never signed any rental application, and never gave you permission to enter my property. I would like an explanation." The room went dead silent. Every head turned to look at Brenda, who had gone slightly red in the face. She cleared her throat and shuffled some papers on the table in front of her. "That was a simple misunderstanding," she said, her voice tight. "I received what I believed to be a legitimate rental application, and I was acting in accordance with my duties as HOA president to facilitate community housing needs." "Can you show me this rental application?" I asked, "because I never filled one out." "I will have to locate it in my files," Brenda said dismissively. "But I assure you, everything was done properly according to HOA procedures. Even if there was an application, which there was not, you do not have the authority to rent out someone else's property," I said, my voice carrying across the room. "And you definitely do not have the right to enter my home whenever you feel like it. The master key provision in the bylaws is for emergencies only." A woman I recognized from down the street raised her hand. Her name was Patricia, and I had talked to her a few times at the mailbox. "Has this happened to other people?" she asked. "Because I went out of town last month, and when I came back, some things in my house seemed off. I thought I was imagining it." Another neighbor, a man named Robert, spoke up. "I got a call a few weeks ago from someone asking about the rent on my house. I told them my house was not for rent, and they seemed confused. They said they had been given my number by the HOA and told the property would be available soon." Brenda was looking more uncomfortable by the second. "I think we are getting off topic. If anyone has specific concerns, they can speak to me privately after the meeting." "No," I said firmly. "This needs to be addressed now in front of everyone. How many houses in this community have you been showing to prospective renters without the owner's knowledge or permission?" "I do not appreciate your accusatory tone, Quincy," Brenda snapped. "I have been working tirelessly to improve property values in this community and to ensure that we maintain high standards. If there have been any miscommunications, they were honest mistakes, nothing more." "Honest mistakes do not involve collecting deposits from people," I said, taking a chance. "Were you collecting money from these prospective renters?" The look on Brenda's face told me everything I needed to know. She had definitely been collecting money. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and angry voices. Harold, the vice president, was staring at Brenda with his mouth hanging open. Doris, the treasurer, looked completely blindsided. "This meeting is adjourned," Brenda said loudly, standing up abruptly. "We will reconvene next month after I have had a chance to review all the relevant documentation." "Sit down," said a voice from the front row. It was a retired lawyer named George who had lived in the community since it was built. "We are not done here. Brenda, if what Quincy is saying is true, you have been committing fraud and possibly embezzlement. The HOA board needs to conduct an immediate investigation, and you need to step down as president until this is resolved." "I will not step down," Brenda said, her voice shaking with anger. "I have done nothing wrong. This is a witch hunt." "Then show us the rental applications," George said calmly. "Show us the documentation for every house you have been trying to rent out. Show us where any deposits or payments you collected have gone. If everything is legitimate, you have nothing to worry about." Brenda grabbed her purse and her folders. "I do not have to justify myself to any of you. This meeting is over." She stormed out of the clubhouse, leaving the rest of us sitting there in stunned silence. Harold and Doris looked at each other uncertainly, and then George stood up and addressed the room. "I think we need to call an emergency HOA board meeting and possibly bring in an outside auditor," he said. "If our president has been misusing her position and potentially stealing from members of this community, we need to know about it. I move that we suspend Brenda Hutchinson from her duties as president pending a full investigation." The motion was seconded immediately and passed with a near-unanimous vote. Only 2 people abstained, and they were friends of Brenda's who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. Harold, as vice president, would take over the day-to-day operations of the HOA until everything was sorted out. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to me and thanked me for speaking up. Patricia told me that she had definitely had someone in her house while she was away because items in her refrigerator had been moved and one of her spare bedroom closets had been opened when she always kept it closed. Robert said he had received 3 different calls from people asking about renting his house over the past 2 months, and he had thought it was just some kind of scam. Now he realized that Brenda had been listing his property without his knowledge. The next morning, I got a call from Officer Martinez at the Scottsdale Police Department. He asked if I could come down to the station to provide additional information. When I arrived, he led me to a small conference room where a detective was waiting. Her name was Detective Laura Simmons, and she specialized in fraud cases. "We have been looking into your complaint, and it turns out you are not the only one," Detective Simmons said, opening a folder on the table. "After your report was filed, we started checking into Brenda Hutchinson and her activities as HOA president. We found several other complaints from people in your neighborhood and others nearby. It appears she has been running this scheme for at least 6 months, possibly longer." "How many people are we talking about?" I asked. "So far, we have identified at least 11 properties in your community alone that she was advertising as available rentals. She was using a fake property management website that she created, listing these homes with photos that she took during her unauthorized entries. She was collecting application fees of $100 and deposits ranging from $500 to $2,000 from prospective tenants." I felt sick. "How much money has she stolen?" "We are still calculating the total, but based on what we have found so far, we are looking at approximately $40,000 to $50,000 in fraudulent deposits and fees." She would collect the money, tell people they were approved, and then come up with excuses about why the move and date kept getting delayed. Eventually, people would give up and ask for their money back, but she would claim that the deposits were non-refundable due to administrative fees. Some people threatened legal action, so she would refund part of the money to make them go away. "That is insane," I said. "How did she think she would get away with this? People like her usually do not think they will get caught," Detective Simmons said. "She probably figured that most people would not pursue legal action over a few $100s, and the ones who did would be easily handled. What she did not count on was someone like you catching her in the act and pushing back. That is what broke the whole thing open." Over the next few weeks, the investigation expanded. Detectives interviewed dozens of people who had applied to rent properties in Meadowbrook Springs, many of whom had no idea they had been scammed. The fake property management website that Brenda had created was taken down, but investigators were able to recover all the data from it, including communications with prospective renters and records of payments received. They also subpoenaed Brenda's bank accounts and found that she had been depositing the fraudulent payments into a personal account, not the HOA's account, which made it clear that this was not a misunderstanding or an administrative error. This was deliberate theft. Meanwhile, Harold and the HOA board hired an independent auditor to review the HOA's finances, and they discovered additional problems. Brenda had been inflating expense reports and paying herself unauthorized bonuses from the HOA's operating funds. She had spent thousands of dollars of community money on personal expenses, including a vacation to Hawaii that she had claimed was for a property management conference. The auditor estimated that she had embezzled at least $30,000 from the HOA over the past 3 years, separate from the rental scam. The community was in an uproar. People were furious that someone they had trusted to manage their neighborhood had been stealing from them and violating their homes. There were calls for criminal prosecution, civil lawsuits, and complete HOA reform. Patricia organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss security measures, and nearly every homeowner showed up. We talked about changing the master key policy, implementing better financial oversight, and setting term limits for HOA board members so that no one person could accumulate too much power again. In late October, Brenda Hutchinson was arrested at her home and charged with multiple counts of fraud, grand theft, embezzlement, and burglary. The burglary charges came from her unauthorized entries into people's homes, which legally constituted breaking and entering even though she had used a key. The arrest made the local news, and I saw footage of her being led out of her house in handcuffs, looking nothing like the confident, condescending woman who had invaded my home a month earlier. She looked scared and small. Her husband filed for divorce within a week of her arrest. Apparently, he had no idea what she had been doing and was horrified when he found out. Their house went up for sale shortly after, and they ended up selling it at a loss just to get out of the neighborhood quickly. I was contacted by the district attorney's office and asked if I would be willing to testify at Brenda's trial. I said yes, without hesitation. I wanted her to face consequences for what she had done, not just to me but to everyone else she had victimized. The DA told me that they had a very strong case because of the extensive documentation and the testimony from multiple victims. Brenda's lawyer tried to argue that she had made mistakes but had not intended to defraud anyone, but it was a weak defense given the amount of evidence against her. The trial began in early December and lasted about 2 weeks. I testified on the 3rd day, describing in detail what had happened when I came home to find Brenda giving a tour of my house. The prosecutor asked me how I felt when I discovered that she had been entering my home without permission, and I told the jury that I felt violated and unsafe in my own house, that I had trouble sleeping for weeks afterward, because I kept worrying that someone might be going through my things or watching me. Several other homeowners testified as well, telling similar stories of unauthorized entries and feeling like their privacy had been destroyed. The prosecution also called several of the people who had paid deposits to Brenda, thinking they were renting legitimate properties. One young woman named Emily testified that she had paid a $1,500 deposit on what she thought was going to be her first apartment after college. She had been so excited about moving to Scottsdale and starting her new job. And then, Brenda kept pushing back the move-in date with various excuses. When Emily finally demanded her deposit back, Brenda told her that she could only refund $500 because the rest had been spent on administrative processing fees. Emily had to move back in with her parents and delay her job start date because she could not afford another deposit anywhere else. The testimony from Emily and others like her was devastating. The jury could see that Brenda had not just stolen money. She had caused real harm to real people, disrupting their lives and taking advantage of their trust. The defense tried to paint Brenda as a well-meaning community volunteer who had gotten in over her head, but it was clear that the jury was not buying it. On December 19th, after deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury found Brenda Hutchinson guilty on all counts. I was in the courtroom when the verdict was read, and I watched Brenda's face crumble as the foreperson announced guilty over and over again for each charge. Her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder, but she was sobbing too hard to hear whatever he was saying to her. Sentencing was scheduled for January, and the DA told us that she was looking at significant prison time given the number of victims and the amount of money involved. The charges carried a potential sentence of up to 15 years, though the actual sentence would depend on various factors including whether Brenda showed remorse and whether she made efforts to pay restitution to her victims. In the weeks leading up to sentencing, several of us who had been victimized by Brenda's schemes worked together to file civil lawsuits to try to recover the money she had stolen. Her assets were frozen as part of the criminal proceedings, but it became clear pretty quickly that she did not have enough money to pay back everything she had taken. She had spent most of it on personal expenses, vacations, designer clothes, and expensive dinners. Her house was underwater on the mortgage, and her bank accounts had less than $10,000 combined. The HOA had insurance that would cover some of the embezzled community funds, but the individual victims of the rental scam would be lucky to recover a fraction of what they had lost. The sentencing hearing took place on January 14th. I took the morning off work to be there, and the courtroom was packed with people who wanted to see justice done. The judge allowed several victims to give impact statements, and I was one of them. I stood up and looked directly at Brenda as I spoke. "You invaded my home and my privacy for your own greed," I said. "You made me feel unsafe in the place where I am supposed to feel most secure. You violated the trust that everyone in our community placed in you, and you did it without any regard for the harm you were causing. I hope you understand the damage you have done, and that you take this time to reflect on why you thought it was acceptable to treat people this way." Brenda did not look at me. She kept her eyes down on the table in front of her, her shoulders shaking. Her lawyer made a plea for leniency, arguing that she had no prior criminal record and that she was deeply remorseful for her actions. Brenda herself gave a brief statement, saying that she was sorry and that she had made terrible mistakes, but her words felt hollow and rehearsed. The judge was not impressed. He said that Brenda had abused a position of trust and had engaged in a calculated, ongoing scheme to defraud vulnerable people. He noted that she had shown no remorse until after she was caught, and that her actions had caused significant financial and emotional harm to dozens of victims. He sentenced her to 8 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 5 years. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to all her victims, though everyone in the courtroom knew that was unlikely to ever happen. Brenda was taken into custody immediately. I watched as the bailiff placed handcuffs on her wrists and led her out of the courtroom through a side door. She was crying, but I felt no sympathy for her. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. After the sentencing, several of us went out to lunch together to decompress and talk about what came next. Patricia, Robert, George, and a few other neighbors sat around a table at a Mexican restaurant near the courthouse, sharing stories and supporting each other. We talked about how the community was healing and what changes we were implementing to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. The HOA had completely rewritten its bylaws with input from every homeowner in Meadowbrook Springs. The master key provision was eliminated entirely, and now emergency access could only be granted by a majority vote of the board, and only in genuine emergencies verified by first responders or utility companies. Financial oversight was dramatically increased, with quarterly audits and monthly financial reports distributed to all homeowners. The board was expanded from 3 members to 7, and term limits were imposed so that no one could serve as president for more than 2 consecutive years. Harold, who had taken over as interim president after Brenda's suspension, decided not to run for the position permanently. He said that the experience had been too stressful and that he preferred to just be a regular homeowner without the responsibility of managing the community. Patricia ended up running for president and won easily. She turned out to be an excellent leader, focused on transparency and community engagement rather than petty enforcement of minor rules. I installed permanent security cameras around my house and kept them running 24/7. I also joined the HOA board as treasurer because I wanted to make sure that the community's finances were being handled properly and that no one would ever be able to embezzle funds again without being caught immediately. It was more work than I had anticipated, but it felt important. I had learned that you could not just assume that people in positions of authority were acting in your best interest. You had to pay attention and hold them accountable. The civil lawsuit against Brenda dragged on for months, but eventually we reached a settlement where she agreed to pay back a portion of what she had stolen using funds from the sale of her house and her retirement accounts. I received about 30% of what she had cost me in legal fees and the expense of changing my locks and installing security systems. It was not everything, but it was something. By the time spring arrived, life in Meadowbrook Springs had returned to something resembling normal. The new HOA board was functioning well, and people felt like they had a say in how the community was run. We had neighborhood barbecues and pool parties, and there was a sense of camaraderie that had not existed before, born from the shared experience of having been victimized and then fighting back together. I ran into Emily, the young woman who had testified about losing her deposit, at a coffee shop in Scottsdale one Saturday morning. She recognized me from the trial and came over to say hello. She told me that she had eventually found a great apartment and that her job was going well. She thanked me for being the one who had pushed back against Brenda and made sure she faced consequences. She said that seeing justice done had helped her move past the anger and frustration she had felt about being scammed. It really mattered that someone stood up and said this is not okay, Emily said. I think a lot of people just would have let it go or been too intimidated to fight back, but you did, and it made all the difference. Her words meant more to me than she probably realized. There had been moments during the investigation and the trial when I had wondered if it was worth all the time and stress and emotional energy. Fighting against someone like Brenda, who had been so confident in her authority and so dismissive of anyone who challenged her, had been exhausting. But hearing from Emily and others who had been helped by my decision to speak up made it clear that it had been worth it. The experience changed me in some fundamental ways. I became more active in my community, more willing to speak up when I saw something wrong, and more aware of the importance of accountability and transparency in any organization. I also became more skeptical of people who claimed to have authority, more likely to ask questions and demand documentation, rather than just accepting what I was told. One of the most satisfying moments came about 6 months after Brenda's sentencing, when I received a letter from the Arizona Department of Corrections. It was a victim notification letting me know that Brenda had been transferred to a state prison in Perryville, where she would be serving out her sentence. The letter included information about her projected release date, which was more than 4 years away, assuming she got parole at the earliest opportunity. It was a reminder that justice, while slow, had ultimately been served. I framed the letter and hung it in my home office, not because I wanted to dwell on what had happened, but because I wanted to remember that standing up for yourself and others mattered. That when someone tries to take advantage of you or violate your rights, you have the power to fight back and hold them accountable. It was a lesson I had learned the hard way, but it was one I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The neighborhood continued to thrive under new leadership. Property values actually increased because people wanted to live in a community that had reformed itself and had strong protections against abuse of power. Real estate agents started using our improved HOA governance as a selling point, telling prospective buyers that Meadowbrook Springs was a community that cared about its residents and had learned from its mistakes. I heard through the grapevine that Brenda's ex-husband had moved to another state and completely cut ties with everyone from their old life in Scottsdale. I did not blame him. It must have been humiliating to discover that your spouse had been living a double life, stealing from neighbors and violating people's homes while pretending to be a respectable community leader. He had been interviewed by police during the investigation and had cooperated fully, providing access to shared bank accounts and documents that helped build the case against Brenda. By all accounts, he had been completely unaware of what she was doing and was genuinely shocked when he found out. As time went on, new families moved into the neighborhood, including into the house that had belonged to Brenda and her husband. A young family with 2 kids bought it, and they were wonderful neighbors. The kids played in the front yard, and the parents were friendly and engaged in community activities. It felt like the house had been cleansed of the negative energy that had surrounded it when Brenda lived there. I continued to serve on the HOA board for another 2 years before stepping down to focus on other things. By that point, the reforms we had implemented were well established, and the community had developed a culture of openness and accountability that made it unlikely anyone would be able to abuse their position the way Brenda had. Patricia remained president for her full term, and then passed the torch to George, the retired lawyer who had been so instrumental in pushing for the investigation in the first place. The whole experience taught me that HOAs, like any organization, are only as good as the people running them and the oversight mechanisms in place to keep those people accountable. When you have someone like Brenda, who is willing to abuse their power for personal gain, and when you have a community that is too passive or too trusting to question what is happening, bad things can happen very quickly. But when people are willing to speak up, to demand answers, and to take action when they see wrongdoing, even the most entrenched bad actors can be brought down. Looking back, I realized that the moment I walked into my house and saw Brenda giving that tour was a turning point not just for me, but for the entire community. If I had been just a few minutes later leaving work that day, if I had not decided to come home early, I might never have caught her in the act. She would have continued her scheme, victimizing more people and stealing more money until eventually something else brought her down. But because I happened to be in the right place at the right time, and because I chose to stand up and fight back rather than letting her intimidate me into silence, dozens of people were spared further victimization, and a dangerous criminal was held accountable for her actions. I still live in Meadowbrook Springs, and I still love my house. The violation of my privacy and security that Brenda committed left scars, but they faded with time. I no longer wake up in the middle of the night wondering if someone has been in my house, and I no longer feel that creeping sense of unease when I come home from work. The security cameras give me peace of mind, and the reformed HOA gives me confidence that my community is looking out for my interests rather than trying to take advantage of me. One evening in late summer, about 2 years after Brenda's sentencing, I was sitting on my back patio with a beer, watching the sunset over the desert hills that surrounded Scottsdale. Patricia stopped by to drop off some documents related to the HOA's annual budget, and she joined me for a drink. We talked about how much things had changed and how proud we were of what the community had accomplished. "You know, you were really brave to stand up to her the way you did," Patricia said. "A lot of people would have just let it go, paid some fine and moved on. But you fought back, and it made all the difference." "I did not feel brave at the time," I admitted. "I was just angry that she thought she could get away with it. Nobody should be able to invade your home and steal from you just because they have some petty authority in a neighborhood association." "Well, whatever your motivation was, I am glad you did it. This is a better place because of you." We clinked our beer bottles together and sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from orange to pink to deep purple. It was a perfect Arizona evening, warm but not too hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of desert flowers. In that moment, I felt deeply grateful for my home, my community, and the knowledge that when pushed, people will stand up for what is right. The final chapter of the Brenda saga came about 3 years after her sentencing, when she became eligible for parole. Several of us who had been victimized by her crimes submitted letters to the parole board, explaining the impact her actions had on us and asking that she serve her full sentence. I wrote about how her violation of my home had affected my sense of security and trust, and how the community was still recovering from the damage she had caused. The parole board denied her application. They cited the severity of her crimes, the number of victims, and the fact that she had shown little genuine remorse beyond regret at being caught. She would have to serve at least another 2 years before she could apply for parole again, and even then, there was no guarantee she would be released. When I got the notification that her parole had been denied, I felt a sense of closure that I had not realized I was still seeking. Justice had been served, not just in the initial conviction and sentencing, but in the ongoing accountability for her actions. She would not be able to walk away from what she had done with just a slap on the wrist. She would serve real time and face real consequences, and that mattered. I shared the news with Patricia and some of the other neighbors who had been involved in the case, and there was a collective sigh of relief. We had all moved on with our lives, but there had been a lingering worry that Brenda might get out early and try to return to the area, or cause trouble for those of us who had testified against her. Knowing that she would be in prison for at least another 2 years gave us peace of mind. Life continued in Meadowbrook Springs with a normalcy that felt hard-won and precious. The community events that Patricia and the new board organized brought people together in ways that had never happened when Brenda was in charge. We had holiday parties, charity fundraisers, and volunteer days where people came together to improve the common areas and help neighbors who needed assistance. The sense of community that developed was genuine and warm, a far cry from the tense, rule-obsessed atmosphere that Brenda had cultivated. I eventually started dating someone I met at one of those community events, a woman named Jessica who had moved into the neighborhood about a year after all the drama with Brenda. She worked as a nurse at a hospital in Phoenix and had a dry sense of humor that I appreciated. When I told her the story of what had happened with the HOA president, she was shocked, but also impressed that I had followed through with pressing charges and testifying. "Most people would have just been glad to get their locks changed and moved on," Jessica said. The fact that you saw it through to the end says a lot about your character." "I just did not want her to get away with it," I said, "and I did not want her to be able to do it to someone else." Jessica and I got serious pretty quickly, and about a year and a half after we started dating, I proposed. We got married in a small ceremony at a venue overlooking Camelback Mountain, with most of Meadowbrook Springs in attendance. It felt right to celebrate this new chapter of my life, surrounded by the community that had supported me through one of the most challenging periods I had ever faced. On our wedding day, Patricia gave a toast that brought tears to my eyes. She talked about how communities were built not just by the houses and streets, but by the people who lived there and their willingness to stand up for each other. She talked about how I had shown courage when it would have been easier to stay silent, and how that courage had inspired others to get involved and make sure that their voices were heard. She said that Meadowbrook Springs was a better place because of people who cared enough to fight for what was right, and that she was honored to call me not just a neighbor but a friend. Jessica and I bought a bigger house in the same neighborhood because we both loved the community and did not want to leave. We talked about starting a family, and the idea of raising kids in Meadowbrook Springs felt right. This was a place where people looked out for each other, where problems were addressed rather than ignored, and where trust had been rebuilt after being shattered. I still served on various HOA committees and stayed involved in community decisions, but I no longer felt the need to be hyper-vigilant about potential abuses of power. The systems we had put in place were working, and the culture of transparency and accountability had taken root. People asked questions, demanded documentation, and did not blindly trust authority figures. It was exactly what a healthy community should look like. 4 years after Brenda's sentencing, I got another notification from the Department of Corrections. She was coming up for parole again, and victims had the opportunity to submit statements. This time, I wrote a shorter letter, simply stating that while I believed in rehabilitation and second chances, I also believed that serious crimes deserved serious consequences. I noted that 4 years was not a long time given the scope of her crimes and the number of people she had hurt. I asked the parole board to consider carefully whether she had truly changed and whether she posed a risk of reoffending if released. The parole hearing took place in March, and this time Brenda was granted parole with strict conditions. She would be on supervised release for the remainder of her sentence, required to maintain employment, prohibited from serving in any position of authority over financial matters, and banned from holding any position with an HOA or similar organization. She was also required to continue making restitution payments to her victims, though by that point she had only paid back a fraction of what she owed. I got the notification of her release with mixed feelings. Part of me thought 4 years was not enough for what she had done, but another part of me recognized that keeping someone in prison indefinitely was not the answer either. The important thing was that she had been held accountable, that she had faced real consequences, and that there were safeguards in place to prevent her from victimizing anyone else in the same way. I heard through the legal grapevine that Brenda had moved to a different state after her release, somewhere in the Midwest where she had family. She was working a minimum wage job and living with relatives, a far cry from the position of power and respect she had enjoyed as HOA president. In some ways that felt like justice too. She had lost everything, her home, her marriage, her reputation, her freedom, all because she had chosen to abuse the trust people placed in her. Jessica and I had our first child that same year, a daughter we named Emma. Holding her in the hospital, I thought about the world I wanted her to grow up in, and I felt grateful that she would be raised in a community that had learned hard lessons about accountability and the importance of standing up against wrongdoing. I wanted to teach her that authority was not something to be blindly respected, that questions should always be asked, and that sometimes doing the right thing meant standing up even when it was uncomfortable or difficult. The story of Brenda Hutchinson and her fraud scheme became something of a local legend in Scottsdale. Real estate agents told prospective buyers about how the community had reformed itself after uncovering corruption in its HOA leadership. Local news did follow-up stories on the 5th anniversary of her arrest, interviewing residents about how the neighborhood had changed. Patricia, George, and I were all interviewed, and we talked about the importance of community vigilance and the systems we had put in place to prevent similar abuses from happening again. Looking back on everything that had happened, from that first moment of unease when I noticed my welcome mat had been moved, to standing in the courtroom watching Brenda be led away in handcuffs, to building a life with Jessica in the community I had fought to protect, I realized that the experience had defined me in ways I never anticipated. I had learned that I was stronger than I thought, that standing up to bullies and criminals was not just possible but necessary, and that communities could heal and grow stronger after being wounded. Meadowbrook Springs was not just a neighborhood anymore. It was a home in the truest sense of the word, a place where people cared about each other and worked together to create something better than what they had inherited. The houses were still beige, the lawns were still manicured, and the HOA still had rules about trash cans and mailbox colors. But underneath all that superficial sameness was a community that had been tested and had emerged stronger, more united, and more committed to doing right by its members. And whenever I pulled into my driveway at the end of a long day, I felt grateful that I lived there, that I had fought for it, and that I had helped make it a place where people could feel safe and secure in their own homes. That was worth everything.